Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Mike Thompson had been working as a guard at Huntsville Maximum Security Prison for 8 years. He had seen violence, despair, and madness countless times within those concrete walls. However, what he encountered in Block D in the winter of 2019 was something no training or experience could have prepared him for. The facility housed over 3,000 inmates, 247 of whom were awaiting execution. Yet Anthony, Big Tony Marchetti's arrival would mark the beginning of events that would haunt Mike for the rest of his life. Big Tony arrived on a cold Tuesday morning in November. As Mike began his shift, the transport vehicle pulled up to the prison gates. The memory was still etched in his mind, 6:47 a.m. The sun had not yet fully risen. A gray, lifeless light hung over the courtyard, making everything look like a faded photograph from the 1940s. Mike, along with 2 colleagues, was assigned to process the new inmate. It was the usual procedure for death row inmates. The first thing Mike noticed about Big Tony was his height. The man was nearly 2 meters tall, around 193 centimeters. His weight was never less than 136 kilograms. But this weight wasn't from fat. The mass of muscle visible even under his orange jumpsuit seemed to wrap around his body like armor. His hands were the size of dinner plates, calloused and scarred from decades of hard labor. But what really sent a chill down Mike's spine were his eyes. Pale blue, almost white, his gaze carried a coldness that pierced through you rather than meeting your own. Anthony Marchetti, the transfer guard, read from his clipboard. Convicted of killing 3 men in a drug deal gone bad. Sentenced to death by lethal injection, no appeals remaining. Execution scheduled for... He paused and whistled low. December 13th. That's just 6 weeks away. Big Tony said nothing during the intake process. He moved when told to move, stopped when told to stop, but his expression never changed. It was like processing a statue that happened to be able to walk. Mike had seen plenty of tough guys come through those doors, men who wore their crimes like badges of honor, but Big Tony was different. There was something ancient about his silence, something that made the air in the processing room feel thick and hard to breathe. Warden Jackson came down personally to oversee the placement. Jackson was a thin, nervous man who had been running the prison for 15 years. He had a habit of clicking his pen when he was anxious, and that morning, the clicking was almost constant. "Put him in D block, cell 47, Jackson said, not looking directly at Big Tony. "Full isolation protocol until further notice. No contact with other inmates." Mike escorted Big Tony to his cell. The walk took them through 3 security checkpoints and down a long corridor lined with reinforced steel doors. The other death row inmates were quiet as they passed. Usually, new arrivals got catcalls, threats, or at least some curiosity, but Big Tony's presence seemed to create a bubble of silence around him. Even the most hardened killers pressed themselves against the backs of their cells as he walked by. Cell 47 was at the end of the row, a 8x10 concrete box with a narrow window that looked out onto a brick wall. The previous occupant had been executed 3 months earlier, and despite multiple cleanings, there was still a faint smell of desperation that clung to the walls. Mike unlocked the door and stepped aside. Big Tony entered the cell and sat down on the metal bunk. For the first time, he spoke. His voice was deep and rough, like gravel being poured into a metal bucket. "You're Mike Thompson," he said. It wasn't a question. Mike's hand instinctively went to his badge, but his name wasn't visible. The standard protocol was to only use badge numbers with death row inmates. "How do you know my name?" Big Tony smiled then, and it was the most unsettling expression Mike had ever seen on a human face. It wasn't cruel or mocking. It was the smile of someone who knew a secret that would destroy you if you learned it. "I know a lot of things, Mike Thompson. I know your wife Sarah is pregnant with your second child. A boy. You're going to name him David, after your father who died in Afghanistan." Mike felt the blood drain from his face. Sarah was pregnant, but they hadn't told anyone yet. They'd only found out the gender the day before. And they'd discussed the name David in their bedroom the previous night. There was no way Big Tony could know any of this. "I also know that Warden Jackson keeps a flask of whiskey in the bottom drawer of his desk, left side. He takes a drink every day at 2:15 p.m. right after his conference call with the State Corrections Board. He's been doing it for 7 years, ever since his son died in that car accident." Mike backed out of the cell and slammed the door shut. His hands were shaking as he locked it. Through the small window in the door, he could see Big Tony sitting calmly on his bunk, that terrible smile still on his face. Mike reported the incident to Warden Jackson immediately. Jackson's face went white when Mike told him about the whiskey and his son. He ordered a full investigation into Big Tony's background, convinced that somehow the inmate had access to private information. They searched his cell, examined every piece of mail he'd received, traced every phone call from the previous prison. They found nothing. The next few days were relatively quiet. Big Tony followed the routine without complaint. He ate his meals, used his hour of exercise time, and spent most of his day sitting on his bunk, staring at the wall. But every time Mike passed his cell during rounds, Big Tony would say something that made Mike's skin crawl. "Your partner, Rodriguez, is going to call in sick tomorrow. Food poisoning from that Chinese place on 5th Street. Rodriguez called in sick the next day. Food poisoning. There's going to be a fight in the yard on Thursday. 2 of the Aryan Brotherhood guys are going to jump one of the Mexican mafia soldiers. Someone's going to lose an eye." Thursday came. The fight happened exactly as Big Tony predicted. An inmate named Carlos Mendoza lost his left eye to a sharpened toothbrush. "The power is going to go out next Tuesday. The backup generator will fail too. You'll be in the dark for 13 minutes. Mike tried to ignore him, but when Tuesday came and the lights went out, when the backup generator sputtered and died, when they were plunged into absolute darkness for exactly 13 minutes, he couldn't deny it anymore. Somehow, Big Tony knew things that hadn't happened yet. Warden Jackson was becoming increasingly agitated. He'd started drinking more, and not just at 2:15 p.m. The other guards were getting spooked too. Word had spread about Big Tony's predictions, and now everyone gave Cell 47 a wide berth. Some of the more superstitious guards had started wearing crosses and muttering prayers when they passed. 3 weeks into Big Tony's incarceration, Mike was doing his midnight rounds when he heard Big Tony call out to him. "Mike, come here. We need to talk." Every instinct told Mike to keep walking, but something in Big Tony's voice made him stop. He approached the cell cautiously. "What do you want?" "I want to tell you something important. Something about December 13th. Your execution date?" Big Tony laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "That's not going to happen, Mike. I'm not going to die on December 13th. But someone is. Is that a threat?" "No, it's a fact. On December 13th, at 11:47 a.m., there's going to be an accident. A gas leak in the execution chamber. When they try to test the equipment for my execution, something will go wrong. The leak will spread through the ventilation system. 17 people are going to die, Mike. Guards, administrators, 2 reporters who are there to witness the execution. 17 people." Mike felt his mouth go dry. How could you possibly know that? The same way I knew about your son David. The same way I knew about Rodriguez and the power outage and everything else. I see it, Mike. I see it all. You're insane. Maybe, but I'm also right. And here's the thing, Mike. One of those 17 people is going to be you. You're going to be in the observation room when it happens. You're going to try to help evacuate people, like the hero you always wanted to be. But the gas will get you. Sarah will give birth to David alone. He'll grow up without a father, just like you did. Mike stumbled backward, his heart racing. His father had died when he was 3. He had no memories of the man except from photographs. The thought of David growing up the same way made him sick. But it doesn't have to happen, Big Tony continued. You can prevent it. All you have to do is make sure I'm not in that execution chamber on December 13th. What are you talking about? Transfer me. Move me to another facility. Delay the execution. I don't care how you do it, but if I'm not in that chamber on December 13th, those 17 people don't die, including you. Mike left without saying another word. He went home that night and held Sarah close, feeling the bump of her pregnant belly against him. He didn't sleep. He kept thinking about Big Tony's words, about David growing up without a father. The next day, Mike went to Warden Jackson's office. "Sir, I think we need to talk about Anthony Marchetti." Jackson looked up from his desk. His eyes were bloodshot, and Mike could smell whiskey on his breath even though it was only 10 a.m. "What about him?" I think there might be something wrong with the execution chamber. Maybe we should have it inspected before the 13th. Jackson's eyes narrowed. "Has he been talking to you? Filling your head with his nonsense?" "Sir, he's been right about everything else." "Coincidences." Jackson slammed his hand on the desk. "Lucky guesses. I've seen cons run this game before. They get inside your head, make you think they have some kind of power. It's all psychological manipulation." "But what if he's right about the gas leak?" Jackson stood up, his face red. "There is no gas leak. We don't even use gas for executions anymore. It's lethal injection, Thompson. You know that." Mike did know that. They hadn't used gas for executions in decades. But somehow, Big Tony's prediction still felt real, still felt possible. As December approached, Mike became increasingly anxious. He started having nightmares about the execution chamber filling with green gas, about watching his colleagues collapse around him, about Sarah crying at his funeral while holding baby David. He tried to avoid D-Block, but his duties required him to pass through regularly. Every time he did, Big Tony would be waiting at his cell door. 23 days, Mike. 18 days, Mike. 2 weeks, Mike. 2 weeks until 17 people die. Other strange things started happening around Big Tony. Inmates in nearby cells reported having vivid nightmares, dreams where they saw their own deaths in graphic detail. One inmate, a man named Jerome Washington, who was scheduled for execution in 3 months, started screaming that he could see himself on the gurney, could feel the needles going into his arms, could taste the chemicals as they stopped his heart. The guards started reporting strange experiences, too. Cold spots in the corridor near cell 47, shadows moving when no one was there, whispers in languages no one recognized. The chaplain, Father Morrison, tried to perform a blessing on the cell block, but he collapsed halfway through, claiming he felt an overwhelming sense of dread that made it impossible to continue. Mike researched Big Tony's background obsessively. Anthony Marchetti had been a low-level enforcer for the mob in New Jersey. Nothing in his record suggested anything unusual. But Mike dug deeper. He found old newspaper articles from Big Tony's hometown. Stories about unexplained phenomena dating back to when Big Tony was a child. Animals dying mysteriously. People having prophetic dreams. a local priest claiming the boy was touched by something evil. On December 10th, 3 days before the scheduled execution, Mike made a decision. He couldn't risk it. He couldn't risk leaving David without a father. He went to Warden Jackson with a proposal. What if we delay the execution, just for a few days? We could say there was a paperwork error or absolutely not. Jackson's response was immediate and firm. The execution happens on schedule. The victims' families are coming. The press has been notified. It's happening, Thompson. And if you can't handle it, I'll find someone who can. That night, Mike didn't go home. He sat in his car in the prison parking lot, wrestling with his conscience. He thought about Sarah, about David, about 17 people dying because he didn't act. As the sun rose on December 11th, he made his choice. Mike had a cousin who worked in the state corrections department. He called in a favor. A computer glitch, his cousin said. These things happen. The execution would need to be postponed while they sorted out the paperwork, maybe a week, maybe 2. Warden Jackson was furious when he got the call from the state. He stormed through the prison, demanding answers, but there was nothing he could do. The execution was officially postponed. On December 13th, Mike called in sick. He stayed home with Sarah, holding her close, watching the clock. 11:47 a.m. came and went. Nothing happened. No news reports of accidents at the prison. No gas leaks. No deaths. Mike began to relax. Maybe Jackson had been right. Maybe it was all just manipulation. His phone rang at 2:15 p.m. It was Rodriguez. Mike, you need to get down here now. What's wrong? It's Jackson. He's dead. Mike's blood turned to ice. What happened? He was in the execution chamber, inspecting it for Marchetti's rescheduled date. There was some kind of malfunction with the old gas system. We haven't used it in years, but apparently there was still gas in the lines. A valve broke. Jackson was trapped inside when it leaked. By the time we got him out, Mike dropped the phone. He drove to the prison in a daze. When he arrived, the parking lot was full of emergency vehicles. He found Rodriguez near the entrance. Was anyone else hurt? No, just Jackson. He was alone in there. Wanted to personally make sure everything was ready for when Marchetti's execution got rescheduled. You know how he was about that guy. Mike felt sick. 1 death instead of 17. Jackson instead of him and 16 others. Had Big Tony known this would happen? Had he planned it somehow? He went to cell 47. Big Tony was sitting on his bunk, that same terrible smile on his face. You knew, Mike said. You knew it would be Jackson. I knew it would be someone, Big Tony replied. The death was always going to happen on December 13th. That was fixed, but who died? How many died? That was still fluid. You changed the pattern, Mike. You saved 16 lives, including your own. How? How do you know these things? Big Tony stood up and walked to the cell door. Up close, Mike could see that his pale blue eyes weren't just pale. They were swirling, like milk being poured into water. I've been able to see things since I was a child. Future things. Death things. It's why I ended up here, Mike. I saw my own path, saw where it led. I could have avoided it, but every path I might have taken led to worse outcomes. More deaths, more suffering. This was the least harmful path. You're saying you chose to become a killer, chose to end up on death row? I killed 3 men who were going to kill 17 children in a school shooting 2 weeks later. I saw it happen in another timeline, Mike. 17 dead kids. So I changed it. 3 dead drug dealers instead. A fair trade, don't you think? Mike didn't know what to think. His world had been turned upside down. My execution has been rescheduled for January 15th. Big Tony continued. "And this time, it will happen. No accidents, no delays. I'll die at 12:01 p.m., and that will be the end of it. But before I go, I need to tell you something." "What?" "David is going to be special, Mike. Like me, but different. Better. He's going to see things too, but he'll see how to prevent disasters, how to save lives. Raise him well. Teach him to be brave. The world is going to need him." Mike left the prison that day and never went back. He put in for a transfer to a minimum security facility 200 miles away. Lower pay, but safer. Sarah supported the decision, especially after what happened to Jackson. Big Tony was executed on January 15th, exactly as he predicted. Mike didn't attend, but he heard about it from Rodriguez. It went smoothly, no complications. Big Tony's last words were, "Tell Mike Thompson that David's first word will be light." 6 months later, Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him David, after Mike's father. For months, Mike watched his son carefully, looking for any sign of the ability Big Tony had described. But David seemed like a normal baby. He cried, he laughed, he slept. Then, one morning when David was 11 months old, Mike was feeding him breakfast when the baby suddenly pointed at the window and spoke his first word. Light. Mike turned to look at what David was pointing at. The sun was just rising, sending golden beams through the kitchen window. But there was something else. For just a moment, Mike could swear he saw something in the light. Shapes, images, fragments of things that hadn't happened yet. A flash of David as a teenager, a glimpse of a disaster being prevented, a vision of lives being saved. Then it was gone, and David was just a baby again, smiling and reaching for his bottle. Mike picked up his son and held him close. He thought about Big Tony, sitting in that cell, seeing all the terrible possibilities that stretched out before him. He thought about the 17 people who didn't die on December 13th. He thought about Jackson, alone in that chamber when the gas leaked. Had Big Tony orchestrated it all? Had he somehow manipulated events so that only one person died instead of 17? Or had Mike's interference changed things in ways that no one could have predicted? He would never know for sure. What he did know was that his son could see things. And unlike Big Tony, who had used his gift to navigate a path of violence and death, David would have a father to guide him, to teach him, to help him use his ability to make the world better. But sometimes, late at night, when Mike was checking on David as he slept, he would see his son's eyes moving rapidly under his closed lids, and he would wonder what futures David was seeing. What disasters was he witnessing? What deaths was he cataloging? And sometimes David would wake up crying, reaching for his father with desperate hands, speaking words that no 11-month-old should know. "They're coming, Daddy. The dark things are coming, and I can see them all." Mike would hold his son and rock him back to sleep, but he never stopped wondering what David meant by the dark things. He never stopped watching the shadows in the corners of David's room, and he never stopped thinking about Big Tony's final message, delivered through Rodriguez after the execution. Tell Mike that David will see the end, not just deaths, the end of everything, and he'll have to choose whether to let it happen or change the path, just like I did. Mike never told Sarah about that message. He never told anyone. But every time David pointed at something no one else could see, every time he spoke about things that hadn't happened yet, Mike remembered Big Tony's words and felt a chill run down his spine. The gift that Big Tony had called special wasn't a blessing. It was a curse. And Mike had brought it into his home, into his family, into his son. David was 2 years old when he started drawing pictures. Not normal toddler scribbles, but detailed images of events. A house on fire 2 blocks away, drawn 3 days before it happened. A car accident at the intersection near their home, sketched a week before the collision. Each drawing more detailed than the last, each prediction more accurate. Sarah wanted to take him to specialists, but Mike convinced her to wait. He couldn't explain how he knew, but he was certain that exposing David's ability would only bring trouble. So they kept it secret, this terrible gift their son possessed. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves. It was David's 3rd birthday when the real horror began. They were having a small party in the backyard, just family and a few close friends. David was playing with his new toys when suddenly he stopped, his eyes rolling back in his head, his small body going rigid. When he came back to himself, he looked directly at Mike and said in a voice that sounded nothing like a 3-year-old, "The prison is calling, Daddy. Cell 47 wants you to know. Big Tony wasn't the first, and David won't be the last. The door is open now, the door that should have stayed closed." Then David collapsed, and when he woke up, he had no memory of what he'd said. That night, Mike called Rodriguez. He didn't want to, but he had to know. "Hey Rodriguez, strange question. Cell 47 in D block. Is anyone in there now?" There was a long pause. "Mike, why are you asking about Cell 47? "Just curious." "Mike," Rodriguez's voice was barely a whisper. "We don't use Cell 47 anymore. We haven't since..." "Since what?" "Since the incident started. After Big Tony's execution, every inmate we put in that cell, they started seeing things, future things. 3 inmates, 3 different times. All of them started predicting deaths. One of them predicted his own death down to the minute. Hung himself with his bedsheet at exactly the time he said he would. The other 2, one gouged his own eyes out, said he couldn't stand seeing what was coming. The other one just stopped eating, stopped drinking, died of dehydration while mumbling about the end of the world." Mike's hand was shaking as he held the phone. "We sealed the cell 6 months ago," Rodriguez continued. "Warden Thomas, Jackson's replacement. He brought in some kind of specialist. A professor from the university who studies paranormal phenomena. The guy took one look at the cell and left. Wouldn't say what he saw, but he was white as a sheet. Told Thomas that some doors, once opened, can't be closed. That some gifts, once given, spread like a virus." Mike hung up the phone and went to check on David. His son was sleeping peacefully, but on the nightstand next to his bed was a new drawing. A picture of a man Mike didn't recognize, standing in front of cell 47. The door was open, and darkness was pouring out like smoke. At the bottom of the picture, in handwriting far too neat for a 3-year-old, were the words, "Coming soon." Mike took the drawing and burned it in the backyard, watching the smoke rise into the night sky, but he knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever Big Tony had started, whatever he had awakened or unleashed, it was spreading, and David was at the center of it. The next morning, Sarah found Mike in David's room, asleep in the chair beside his son's bed. She didn't wake him. She'd seen the fear in his eyes lately, the way he watched David, the way he jumped at every strange word their son spoke. She didn't know about Big Tony. She didn't know about Cell 47. She didn't know about the 17 people who didn't die or the one who did. But she knew something was wrong with David, something that went beyond normal childhood development. And she knew Mike was keeping secrets. That day, while Mike was at work and David was at preschool, Sarah did something she'd promised herself she wouldn't do. She went through Mike's things. She found his old work files, the ones from Huntsville. She read about Anthony Big Tony Marchetti. She read Mike's reports, the ones he'd written about the predictions, the warnings, the impossibilities. When Mike came home that evening, Sarah was waiting for him with the files spread across the kitchen table. "You knew," she said. "You knew what David was before he was even born. Big Tony told you, didn't he?" Mike couldn't deny it. He told her everything. about the predictions, about Jackson's death, about the choice he'd made to save 16 lives, about Big Tony's final message. Sarah listened in silence, her face growing paler with each revelation. When Mike finished, she asked only one question. "What do we do?" Before Mike could answer, they heard David screaming from his room. They ran upstairs to find him standing in his crib, pointing at the wall, tears streaming down his face. "The dark man is here," he cried. "The dark man from the cell. He says it's time. He says the door is opening wider." Mike looked at where David was pointing but saw only an empty wall. Sarah grabbed David and held him close, but he continued to scream and point. "Make him go away, Daddy. Make the dark man go away." That night, they didn't sleep. They took turns watching David, who eventually exhausted himself and fell into a fitful slumber. Around 3 a.m., Mike's phone rang. It was Rodriguez. "Mike, I don't know if this means anything to you, but I thought you should know. Cell 47, someone opened it. The seal is broken, the door is standing wide open. Security cameras show nobody going near it, but it's open. And Mike, there's something else." "What?" "There's a drawing on the wall inside the cell. It wasn't there before. It's a picture of a little boy. And at the bottom, it says David Thompson, age 3. Mike, how would anyone know about your son?" Mike ended the call and looked at his sleeping child. David's eyes were moving rapidly under his lids again, and his lips were forming silent words. Mike leaned closer to hear what his son was saying in his sleep. 7 days, David whispered. 7 days, until the first one arrives. 7 days until the door can't be closed anymore. 7 days, and then they all come through. Mike didn't know what was coming in 7 days. He didn't know who they were or what door David was talking about. But he knew one thing for certain. Big Tony's gift hadn't been a gift at all. It had been a curse, a contagion, something that spread from person to person, growing stronger with each host. And now it had infected his son. Mike looked at Sarah, saw his own fear reflected in her eyes. They had 7 days to figure out what was happening. 7 days to protect their son. 7 days before something came through a door that Big Tony had opened and that David could see. Outside, in the darkness beyond their window, something moved. Something that shouldn't exist. Something that had been waiting in cell 47 for someone like Big Tony to set it free. And somewhere in the distance, Mike could swear he heard Big Tony's voice, carried on the wind like a whisper from beyond the grave. "I tried to choose the path with the least harm, Mike. But some paths don't lead to less harm. They just delay the inevitable. The door was always going to open. I just made sure someone would be there to watch it happen. Someone who might be able to do what I couldn't." Mike held Sarah's hand and watched his son sleep, knowing that in 7 days everything would change. The gift that Big Tony had passed on, the curse that now lived in David, it was growing stronger. And whatever was coming through that door, whatever darkness Big Tony had seen in his visions of the future, it was almost here. The clock on David's nightstand ticked steadily toward dawn, counting down the hours, the minutes, the seconds, until the 7 days were up. Until the door that cell 47 had become finally opened all the way, and released whatever had been waiting on the other side. Carlos Mendoza had been working the night shift at Blackwater Correctional Facility for 3 years, but he'd never gotten used to the sounds. Every prison had its own symphony of misery. The clanging of metal doors, the shouting of inmates, the echoing footsteps of guards on patrol. But Blackwater had something else. Something that made even the most hardened corrections officers request transfers after a few months on the graveyard shift. It was the whispering. Carlos first heard it on a Tuesday night in October. He was doing his rounds through C Block, the oldest wing of the prison, when he passed cell 19. The cell had been empty for 20 years according to the records. The door was welded shut, had been since '99. The small window in the door was covered with a metal plate, bolted from the outside. Yet, as Carlos walked past, he could have sworn he heard someone whispering from inside. He stopped, pressed his ear against the cold metal door. Nothing. Just the usual ambient noise of the prison at night. Distant snoring, the hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional cough or muttered dream talk from occupied cells. He shook his head and continued his rounds, chalking it up to imagination and too much coffee. But the next night he heard it again. This time it sounded like multiple voices, having a hushed conversation. Carlos checked the logbook at the guard station. Cell 19, permanently decommissioned, October '99. No additional information provided. He asked Officer Williams, who'd been working at Blackwater for 15 years, about it during their shift change. Williams was a big man, 6'3" and built like a linebacker. But when Carlos mentioned cell 19, he saw something flicker in Williams' eyes. Fear? No, that couldn't be right. Williams wasn't afraid of anything. "Don't go near that cell," Williams said, his voice lower than usual. "Just do your rounds and ignore it." "Why? What happened there?" Williams looked around to make sure they were alone. "You ever hear about Ghost?" "Ghost?" "Inmate they used to have here. Real name was Marcus Gray, but everyone called him Ghost because of how quiet he was. Could move through the prison without making a sound. Guards would find him in places he shouldn't be, couldn't figure out how he got there. So they put him in solitary." Williams shook his head. "It was worse than that. Ghost, he did something bad. 20 years ago, Halloween night, 1999. 3 inmates were found dead in their cells. Doors were still locked from the outside, no sign of struggle. They were just dead, eyes wide open, faces twisted like they'd seen something horrible." Carlos felt a chill run down his spine. "And Ghost?" "They found him in cell 19, covered in blood that wasn't his. He was just sitting there, drawing on the walls with it. Symbols, weird writing, pictures that hurt to look at. He said he'd made a deal, said he'd found a way out that didn't involve doors or walls. What happened to him?" Williams was quiet for a long moment. "Official record says he was transferred to a psychiatric facility, but I heard different. I heard he disappeared from that cell the same night they found the bodies. Vanished. Door was still locked. No way in or out. They searched the entire prison, brought in dogs, checked every inch of the ventilation system. Nothing, so they welded the door shut and tried to forget about it." Carlos wanted to laugh it off as a ghost story, something the older guards told to spook the newbies. But the look in Williams' eyes was too genuine, too haunted. That night, Carlos made a point of walking past cell 19 more slowly. The whispering was louder this time, and he could almost make out words. It sounded like someone counting, 17, 18, 19, 20. Then it started over. 1, 2, 3. He radioed Williams. "You hearing anything weird in C Block?" There was a pause. "Stay away from 19, Carlos." "I'm just asking if you hear anything." "I hear lots of things. Doesn't mean I listen, neither should you." But Carlos couldn't help himself. Each night the whispering grew louder, more distinct. Sometimes it was counting. Sometimes it was what sounded like a conversation between multiple people. Once, he could have sworn he heard his own name. After 2 weeks of this, Carlos decided to do some research. He went to the prison library, which kept old newspapers and records. He found the articles from October 1999. 3 inmates found dead. Robert Henley, James Torres, and Mitchell Davies. The articles mentioned an investigation but no charges filed. No mention of Marcus Ghost Gray. He dug deeper, going through employment records. He found a guard who'd worked C Block in '99. Thomas Fletcher, retired, living about an hour away. Carlos got his address and decided to pay him a visit on his day off. Fletcher lived in a small house on the outskirts of town. When Carlos introduced himself and mentioned Blackwater, Fletcher's face went pale. "You're here about cell 19, aren't you?" Fletcher said before Carlos could explain. Someone finally heard him. Heard who? Fletcher invited him in, poured them both coffee with shaking hands. Ghost never left that cell. Whatever he did, whatever deal he made, he's still there. Not in the way we understand, but he's there. That's impossible. The cell's been empty for 20 years. Fletcher laughed bitterly. Empty? Son, that cell is the furthest thing from empty. It's too full, that's the problem. I don't understand. Fletcher pulled out an old notebook, pages yellowed with age. I kept a record. After they sealed the cell, guards started reporting things, whispers, shadows moving inside even though the door was welded shut. Some guards said they saw faces in the metal plate covering the window, different faces each time. He showed Carlos the notebook, page after page of incident reports that were never officially filed. Guards hearing voices, seeing things, some having complete mental breakdowns after walking past cell 19. 1999, the voices started, Fletcher read. 2003, Officer Martinez swore he saw hands pressing against the inside of the door. 2007, Officer Kim reported that the metal plate was hot to the touch, like something was burning inside. 2010, 3 guards quit on the same night after they said they heard screaming from the cell. 2015, Officer Johnson had to be institutionalized after he tried to break open the door with a crowbar, claiming someone inside was calling for help. Why didn't anyone do anything? What could they do? Open it? Let out whatever's in there? The warden, the administration, they just wanted it forgotten. Easier to ignore it, pretend it doesn't exist. Carlos left Fletcher's house with more questions than answers. That night, he stood in front of cell 19 for a full 5 minutes just listening. The whispering was clear now. 20 years, 20 years, 20 years. Then a different voice. He's listening. And another. He can hear us. Carlos backed away, but the voices followed him. Help us. Let us out. We didn't deserve this. He ran back to the guard station where Williams was doing paperwork. They're talking to me, Carlos gasped. The voices in cell 19, they're talking directly to me. Williams stood up, grabbed Carlos by the shoulders. Listen to me very carefully. You need to request a transfer. Tonight. Get out of C Block and don't come back. What's in that cell, Williams? Williams hesitated, then pulled Carlos into the security office where they kept the surveillance monitors. He typed in an old password, bringing up archived footage. This is from 1999, the night before they sealed the cell. The grainy black and white footage showed cell 19. The door was open and Carlos could see inside. A man sat on the floor, surrounded by strange symbols drawn in what looked like blood. But that wasn't what made Carlos's blood run cold. Behind the man, the cell seemed to extend far beyond what was physically possible. The back wall wasn't there. Instead, there was a corridor that stretched into darkness. And in that darkness, Carlos could see shapes moving. Human shapes, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin, joints bending in ways they shouldn't. What is that? Ghost opened something, Williams said quietly. A door, a portal, whatever you want to call it. Those things, they came through. The 3 dead inmates? They saw them, and the sight killed them. Heart failure, the coroner said. But really they died of fear. And Ghost? He went through. To the other side, but the door didn't close. They sealed the cell, but the door is still open. And everyone who's gone to the other side, they're trying to come back. Carlos stared at the screen. Everyone? Williams nodded grimly. Every inmate who's died in this prison since '99. Every guard who had a heart attack on duty. Every suicide. They don't move on. They get pulled through that door. And they're all in there, in cell 19, in whatever space exists behind our reality. That's insane. Is it? You've heard them, haven't you? How many voices did you count? Carlos thought about it. In the past few nights, he'd heard at least a dozen different voices. Maybe more. I've got a list, Williams continued, pulling out a file. Everyone who's died in Blackwater since 1999. 237 names, and I think they're all in there. That night, Carlos couldn't focus on his rounds. He kept thinking about those 237 souls, trapped in some nightmarish space behind cell 19. He found himself standing in front of the door again. "Please," a voice whispered. It sounded young, scared. "Please help us. It's dark here, so dark. And the things that live here, they're hungry. Who are you?" Carlos whispered back. "Tommy Morrison. I died in 2005. Suicide. They said I hung myself, but I didn't want to die. I just wanted the voices to stop. But dying didn't help. It just brought me here." More voices joined in, each one telling their story. An inmate who was stabbed in the shower. A guard who had a heart attack. An old man who died in his sleep. All of them pulled into whatever hell existed beyond cell 19. "How do I help you?" Carlos asked. The voices went silent. Then Ghost's voice, different from the others, older, more distorted. "You can't help them, but you can join them. All you have to do is open the door." Carlos stumbled backward. The metal plate covering the window began to glow with a faint red light. He could hear something scratching at it from the inside. He ran. He didn't stop running until he was out of C Block, out of the prison, in his car, driving home. He called in sick for the next 3 days, trying to decide what to do. But the voices followed him home. In his dreams, he stood in a corridor that stretched forever, lined with doors. Behind each door, someone was screaming. On the 4th day, Williams called him. "Carlos, you need to come back. Something's happened." "What?" "The plate. The metal plate on cell 19. It's changing." Carlos drove to the prison, his hands shaking. Williams met him at the entrance and led him to C Block. A crowd of guards had gathered around cell 19, all staring at the door. The metal plate was no longer smooth. Images had appeared on its surface, etched as if from the inside. Faces. Dozens of faces, all screaming, and in the center, clearer than the others, was a new face. It was Carlos's face. "It appeared this morning," Williams said, "right after you called in sick." Carlos approached the door slowly. His etched face stared back at him, mouth open in a silent scream. As he watched, words began to appear below it, as if being carved by an invisible hand. "You heard us. You know the truth. Join us, or free us. Choose." The other guards backed away, looking at Carlos with a mixture of fear and pity. "What does it mean?" one of them asked. Carlos knew exactly what it meant. Ghost was giving him a choice. Open the door and release whatever was trapped inside, or eventually be pulled in himself. Because now that he'd heard them, now that he'd acknowledged them, He was connected to cell 19. That night, Carlos stood guard alone in C block. Williams had tried to stay with him, but Carlos sent him away. This was his problem now. At exactly 3 a.m., the whispering stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the voices had ever been. Then, the metal plate began to heat up, glowing brighter and brighter until Carlos had to shield his eyes. When the glow faded, the plate had changed again. Now, it showed not faces, but a scene. Carlos saw himself standing in front of the door with a cutting torch. He saw himself removing the plate, breaking the welds. He saw the door opening, and he saw what came out. The vision was so horrifying that Carlos fell to his knees, retching. The things that emerged from cell 19 weren't human anymore. 20 years in that place, that in-between space, had changed them, twisted them. They were shadows with too many limbs, faces where faces shouldn't be, bodies that folded in and out of reality like origami made of flesh and nightmare. But worse than their appearance was their hunger. In the vision, Carlos watched these things spread through the prison, through the town, devouring everything in their path. Not eating exactly, but unmaking, pulling everything and everyone into that dark space behind cell 19. The vision faded, and new words appeared on the plate. This is what happens if you free us, but if you don't, you'll join us. 1 week, decide. Carlos spent the next week researching everything he could about Ghost, about cell 19, about the nature of reality itself. He found references in old books about thin places, spots where the wall between worlds was weak. He read about the old asylum that had stood where Blackwater was built, about the Native American burial ground beneath that, about the even older things that were said to dwell in the earth there. He learned that Ghost's real name wasn't Marcus Gray. That was an alias. His real name was Dr. Marcus Grayson, and he'd been a quantum physicist before he was arrested for killing his entire research team. At his trial, he'd claimed they were trying to stop him from completing his work, from proving that parallel dimensions existed and could be accessed. Apparently, he'd succeeded. On the 7th night, Carlos stood in front of cell 19 with a decision to make. The other guards had been avoiding him all week, sensing that something was happening, something beyond their understanding. Even Williams kept his distance. "Have you decided?" Ghost's voice echoed from behind the door. "I have," Carlos said. "But first, I want to know something. Why did you do it? Why did you open that door?" There was a long pause. Then Ghost spoke, and for the first time, he sounded human, tired, regretful. "I wanted to prove I was right, that there were other worlds, other dimensions. I thought I could control it, study it, but the moment I opened that door, I realized my mistake. The things that live in the spaces between worlds, they're not meant to be seen, not meant to be known. They're the opposite of existence, the antimatter of reality, and once you let them in, they don't leave. So you trap them in the cell? I trapped myself with them. I thought if I stayed, if I kept them contained, they couldn't spread. But I was wrong. Every death in this place feeds them, makes them stronger, and now they're strong enough to break free on their own. The only question is whether you'll let them out controlled, or wait until they burst out on their own." Carlos pulled out the cutting torch he'd hidden in his jacket. "There's a third option. What are you doing?" Carlos didn't answer. Instead, he began cutting, not the welds on the door, but the walls around it. He'd spent the week studying the prison's blueprints, found the structural weak points. If he couldn't free the souls trapped in cell 19, and he couldn't let them spread, then he'd bury them. "Stop!" Ghost's voice was panicked now. "You don't know what you're doing." But Carlos kept cutting. He'd already called in an anonymous tip about a gas leak in C block. The evacuation would begin in 5 minutes. He just had to weaken the supports enough. The walls began to shake. Dust rained from the ceiling. The metal plate on cell 19 glowed white-hot, and Carlos could hear hundreds of voices screaming at once. "You'll kill us all!" Ghost shouted. "You're already dead," Carlos replied, making the final cut. The ceiling of C block began to collapse. Carlos ran, the structure failing behind him like dominoes. He made it to the exit just as the entire wing came down, tons of concrete and steel crushing cell 19 and everything inside it. The official report blamed structural failure due to age and poor maintenance. No one was hurt in the collapse thanks to the evacuation. C block was never rebuilt. Instead, they covered the rubble with concrete, turning it into a parking lot. Carlos transferred to a different prison the next week. He never spoke about what happened, not even to Williams. But sometimes, on quiet nights, he'd think about those voices, those souls trapped in the space between worlds. Were they destroyed when the cell was crushed? Or were they still there, buried under tons of rubble, still whispering in the dark? A year later, Carlos got his answer. He was visiting the old site, drawn back by guilt and curiosity. The parking lot was empty except for his car. As he stood over the spot where cell 19 had been, he heard it. Faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Whispering, coming from below. 1, 2, 3, 4. The counting continued, and Carlos realized with growing horror that it wasn't counting up to 20 anymore. It was counting much higher. 237, 238, 239. The numbers stopped there, and Carlos heard his own name whispered from beneath tons of concrete. "Carlos, you're number 239. You died the moment you heard us. You just don't know it yet." Carlos ran to his car, drove home, tried to forget. But the number stayed with him. 239. Every night, in his dreams, he stood in that impossible corridor behind cell 19, and Ghost was there, smiling. "You can't bury a door that doesn't exist in normal space," Ghost would say. "You just made it harder to find. But we're still here, all of us, waiting. And one day, when you least expect it, you'll find yourself on this side of the door. Because you've been marked, Carlos. The moment you heard us, you became one of us." Carlos quit his job, moved across the country, tried to start fresh. But every October 31st, on the anniversary of Ghost's disappearance, Carlos would dream of cell 19. And each year the dream became more vivid, more real. He could feel the cold of that impossible corridor, smell the decay of souls rotting in spaces between worlds. 5 years after C block collapsed, Carlos woke up on Halloween night to find his bedroom door had changed. It was metal now, with a small window covered by a plate. The number 19 was etched into its surface. He approached the door slowly, knowing what he'd find on the other side. As his hand touched the handle, he heard Ghost's voice one last time. "Welcome home, number 239. We've been waiting for you." Carlos opened the door and stepped through. His neighbors found his apartment empty the next morning. The door standing open, no sign of struggle. The police investigated, but found nothing. Carlos Mendoza had simply vanished. But in Blackwater, in the parking lot that covered the ruins of C block, security guards reported something strange. On quiet nights, if you stood in just the right spot and listened carefully, you could hear whispering. And sometimes, mixed in with all the other voices counting their eternal numbers, you could hear a new voice. 239. 239. 239. The parking lot was eventually abandoned too. They put up a fence, warning signs, kept people away. but teenagers still snuck in on Halloween, drawn by the urban legend of the buried cell. Most left quickly, spooked by the atmosphere. But occasionally, one would stay too long, listen too closely to the whispers from below, and the count would go up by 1, 240, 241, 242. The door that Ghost opened in 1999 never closed. It just moved, shifted, became harder to see. But it was still there, still pulling in souls, still growing stronger. And somewhere, in that dark space between worlds, Carlos Mendoza stood with all the others, whispering through tons of concrete and steel, hoping someone would hear. Hoping someone would make the same mistake he did. Hoping someone would listen. Because in Blackwater Correctional Facility, the dead don't rest. They just wait, counting the moments until the living join them in that impossible space behind a door that should never have been opened. And the count continues to rise. Frank Castellano had been a prison guard for 15 years, and he prided himself on being able to read people. In a place like Riverbend State Penitentiary, that skill could save your life. He could spot a troublemaker from across the yard, sense when a fight was about to break out, and knew which inmates were planning something just by the way they walked. But Isaiah Whitmore, known to everyone as Preacher, was different. He was the one inmate Frank could never quite figure out. Preacher had arrived at Riverbend 3 months ago, convicted of fraud and embezzlement. White-collar crime, non-violent. The kind of prisoner who usually kept their head down and counted the days until release. He was 53 years old, slightly built, with gray hair that he kept neatly combed and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the appearance of a college professor. He spoke softly, never raised his voice, and always had a gentle smile on his face. The name Preacher came naturally. He'd been a minister on the outside, ran a megachurch in Oklahoma before the FBI discovered he'd been stealing from the congregation. $5 million over 10 years, hidden in offshore accounts and fake charities. The judge gave him 15 years, and somehow he'd ended up in Riverbend instead of a minimum security facility. Some paperwork error, Frank had heard. At first, Frank thought Preacher would have a hard time. A soft-spoken minister in a maximum security prison. He'd be eaten alive, but something strange happened. Within a week, Preacher had gathered a following. Not a gang exactly, but a group of inmates who hung on his every word. They called themselves his congregation. It started small. Preacher would hold informal Bible studies in the recreation room. 3 or 4 inmates at first, then 10, then 20. By the end of his first month, nearly 50 inmates were attending his sermons. Frank had watched from the catwalk, curious about what this mild-mannered fraudster could possibly say to captivate hardened criminals. Preacher's sermons were unlike anything Frank had heard in church. He spoke about transformation, about the power within each man to change his nature, about how the walls of the prison were just illusions, and that true freedom came from within. It sounded like typical self-help nonsense to Frank, but the inmates were mesmerized. What concerned Frank wasn't the sermons themselves, but the effect they had. Inmates who attended Preacher's sessions began to change. Not in the way you'd expect from religious conversion. They didn't become kinder or more peaceful. They became different, quieter. They moved in sync, like they were sharing the same thoughts. They all developed the same gentle smile that Preacher wore, the same soft way of speaking. Frank mentioned his concerns to Diana Reyes, the head nurse at the prison infirmary. Diana had been at Riverbend for 7 years and had seen her share of strange behavior among the inmates. "Have you noticed anything odd about Preacher's followers?" Frank asked her one afternoon. Diana frowned, flipping through some medical files. "Now that you mention it, yes. 5 of them came in last week with the exact same symptoms. Headaches, insomnia, and they all reported having the same recurring dream. The same dream. They described it identically. They're standing in a dark room, and Preacher is there, but he's not alone. There's something standing behind him, something they can't quite see, and he's feeding it. Feeding it what? Diana shrugged. They couldn't say, or wouldn't. They all just smiled when I asked for details. Frank decided to pay closer attention to Preacher. He started documenting everything. Who attended the sermons, how long they stayed, how they behaved afterward. A pattern emerged that made his skin crawl. Every inmate who spent more than 3 sessions with Preacher underwent a complete personality change. Violent offenders became docile. Gang members abandoned their affiliations. Drug addicts stopped showing withdrawal symptoms. On the surface, it looked like successful rehabilitation, but Frank knew better. These men weren't getting better. They were being replaced. The first incident happened on a Thursday evening. Robert Kruger, a neo-Nazi serving life for murder, had been one of Preacher's earliest converts. Frank was doing his rounds when he found Kruger in his cell, carving something into his arm with a sharpened toothbrush. But Kruger wasn't grimacing in pain. He was smiling that same gentle smile, humming a hymn as he worked. Frank called for backup and medical. When Diana arrived, she gasped at what Kruger had carved, a symbol that looked like an eye surrounded by tentacles or roots. The cuts were deep, but there was barely any blood. "Doesn't it hurt?" Diana asked, cleaning the wounds. Kruger looked at her with glassy eyes. "Pain is just a door, miss. Preacher taught us that. And when you walk through the door, you find him waiting on the other side." "Who's him?" Frank demanded. Kruger's smile widened. "The one who watches, the one who waits, the one who welcomes." They put Kruger in psychiatric observation, but he never elaborated. He just sat in his cell, smiling, tracing the symbol he'd carved into his arm over and over again. The next day, Frank found 3 more inmates with the same symbol carved into their skin. Then 5 more, then a dozen. All of them were part of Preacher's congregation. All of them had that same serene smile, that same glassy-eyed stare. Frank went to the warden with his concerns, but Warden Blackstone wasn't interested. "Crime in the prison is down 40% since Whitmore arrived," Blackstone said. "No fights, no drugs, no gang activity. Whatever he's doing, it's working. Sir, these men are mutilating themselves. They're not getting better. They're becoming model prisoners," Blackstone interrupted. "That's all I care about. Leave Whitmore alone, Frank. That's an order." But Frank couldn't leave it alone. That night, he snuck into the chapel where Preacher held his largest gatherings. He hid a small camera behind a loose brick, wanting to record what happened during these sessions. The next evening, he retrieved the camera and watched the footage in his car. What he saw made him question his sanity. The video started normally. Preacher stood at the makeshift pulpit, speaking to about 60 inmates. His sermon was about surrendering the self, about becoming vessels for something greater. The inmates swayed slightly as he spoke, as if hypnotized. Then, at exactly midnight, something changed. The lights in the chapel dimmed, though no one had touched the switches. Preacher's shadow on the wall behind him began to move independently, growing larger, taking on a shape that wasn't quite human. The shadow had too many angles, too many appendages, and what might have been eyes that seemed to look directly at the camera. Preacher raised his arms, and the inmates stood in unison. They began to speak, but not in English. It was a language Frank had never heard, all consonants and clicking sounds that human throats shouldn't be able to make. As they chanted, their shadows also began to change, stretching and writhing on the walls like living things. Then, Preacher did something that made Frank's blood freeze. He reached into his own shadow, his hand disappearing into the darkness on the wall as if it were a portal. When he pulled it back out, he was holding something. The camera quality wasn't good enough to see clearly, but it looked organic, pulsing with a faint light. Preacher broke the thing into pieces and distributed them to his congregation like communion wafers. Each inmate who consumed a piece underwent an immediate change. Their eyes rolled back, their bodies convulsed, and when they recovered, they were different. Fuller somehow, as if something had crawled inside them and taken up residence. Frank stopped the video, his hands shaking. He knew he had to do something, but who would believe him? He decided to confront Preacher directly, hoping to get some answers. He found Preacher in the library the next day, reading a book that looked ancient, its pages yellowed and cracked. The text wasn't in English and the symbols on the pages hurt to look at. "Hello, Frank," Preacher said without looking up. "I've been expecting you. What are you doing to these men?" Preacher closed the book carefully and looked at Frank with those gentle eyes. "I'm saving them. You see, Frank, this prison isn't a place of punishment. It's a place of potential. All these broken souls, all this despair and anger and hatred, it's the perfect feeding ground." Feeding ground for what? For something that's been sleeping for a very long time. Something that whispers to those who know how to listen. I learned to listen years ago, long before I came here. My crime, my arrest, my placement in this particular prison, it was all planned. He needed me here. Who is he? Preacher smiled. Names have power, Frank. Let's just say he's older than names, older than language, older than thought itself. He exists in the spaces between spaces, in the shadows that shadows cast. And he's hungry. You're insane. Am I? Look around you, Frank. Look at what I've accomplished. No violence, no chaos, just peaceful surrender. These men have given themselves willingly. They're not prisoners anymore. They're vessels. Vessels for what? For his return. You see, he can't enter our world directly. He needs bodies, minds, souls to anchor him. Each member of my congregation is a door, and when I have enough doors, he can finally come through. Frank backed away. I'm going to stop you. Preacher laughed softly. No, Frank, you're not. Because you've already been exposed. Every time you've watched us, every time you've listened to my sermons, you've been taking him in. He's in your dreams now, isn't he? The dark room, the presence you can't quite see? Frank's blood ran cold. He had been having that dream. Every night for the past week. It starts with dreams, Preacher continued. Then you'll start hearing his voice. Whispers at first, then clearer. He'll show you things. Truths about reality that will break your small mind. And eventually, you'll beg to join us, just to make it stop. Frank left the library and went straight to Diana. He told her everything, showed her the video. Diana watched in horror, her medical training warring with what she was seeing. We have to get help, she said. The FBI, someone. But when they tried to copy the video, the file was corrupted. When they tried to call outside authorities, the phones didn't work. When Diana tried to leave the prison to report in person, her car wouldn't start. It was as if the prison itself was preventing them from seeking help. That night, Frank's dream was different. He was in the dark room, but now he could see the thing behind Preacher more clearly. It was massive. A writhing mass of flesh and eyes and mouths, existing in dimensions his mind couldn't fully process. It spoke to him in a language that bypassed his ears and went straight to his brain. Join, it said. Surrender. Become. Frank woke up screaming. He found that he'd carved something into his own arm while sleeping, the first curve of that terrible symbol. He bandaged it quickly, terrified of what was happening to him. The next day, more inmates joined Preacher's congregation. The chapel was full during his sermons. Even some of the guards were attending, their eyes taking on that glassy sheen, their mouths forming that gentle smile. Diana was the only one Frank could trust. They met in secret, trying to figure out how to stop what was happening. "I've been reading about this," Diana said, showing Frank printouts from obscure websites. "There are stories, legends about things like this. Entities that exist outside our reality, that can influence our world through believers. They're called the Old Ones, the Outer Gods, different names in different cultures. How do we stop it? According to this, the only way is to break the connection. Kill the conduit, in this case Preacher, before the entity fully manifests." Frank knew what she was suggesting. Murder. It went against everything he believed in, everything he'd sworn to uphold as a guard. But as he looked around the prison, seeing more and more inmates and guards with that same empty smile, he knew they were running out of time. They made their plan. Diana would drug Preacher during his medical checkup, make it look like a heart attack. It was scheduled for tomorrow. One more day, and this nightmare would be over. But that night, Preacher came to Frank in his dream. Not the thing behind him, but Preacher himself, standing in Frank's bedroom, though Frank knew he was actually asleep in his cell. "You can't stop this, Frank," Dream Preacher said. "It's already too late. Tomorrow, during the eclipse, the final door will open, and he will walk among us." Frank woke up and checked his phone. There was indeed a solar eclipse tomorrow, something he hadn't known about. The next morning, Diana was missing. Frank found her in the infirmary, but she wasn't herself anymore. She had that smile, those glassy eyes. She'd carved the symbol into both her arms. "He showed me the truth, Frank," she said in a dreamy voice. "He showed me what's coming. It's beautiful. We're going to be part of something so much greater than ourselves." Frank was alone now. The entire prison was under Preacher's influence except for him, and he could feel his own resistance weakening. The whispers were constant now, the symbol on his arm burning with the need to be completed. As the eclipse began, Preacher gathered his congregation in the yard. All the inmates, all the infected guards, standing in perfect formation, their faces turned to the darkening sky. Frank watched from the tower, his rifle trained on Preacher. He could end this now, one shot. But as the moon began to cover the sun, something happened. The shadows in the yard started to deepen, to spread, to take on substance. They flowed together like liquid darkness, and in that darkness something enormous began to take shape. Frank could see it clearly now, the thing from his dreams. It was pushing through from wherever it existed, using the congregation as anchor points. Each person was a tether, holding a piece of it in this reality. And at the center was Preacher, his arms raised, laughing with joy. "Welcome," Preacher shouted. "Welcome to your new world." Frank aimed at Preacher and pulled the trigger. The bullet flew true, striking Preacher in the chest. He fell, blood spreading across his prison uniform. For a moment, Frank thought he'd done it. But Preacher didn't die. He stood up, the wound in his chest sealing itself. He looked up at Frank and smiled. "You can't kill me, Frank. I'm not really here anymore. None of us are. We're all just extensions of him now." The thing in the shadows was fully formed now, a massive entity that existed partially in this world and partially in others. It had countless eyes, all focused on Frank. It spoke, and its voice was the combined voices of every person in the yard. "Join us, Frank. You're the last one, the last door. Open yourself to us, and the transformation will be complete." Frank felt his resistance crumbling. The symbol on his arm was burning, demanding to be finished. The rifle fell from his hands. He began walking toward the yard, his feet moving without his conscious control. As he descended the tower stairs, he passed a mirror. His reflection showed him the truth. He was already changing. His shadow was wrong, too large with too many arms. His eyes were starting to glass over. The smile was beginning to form on his lips. He entered the yard and took his place among the congregation. Preacher approached him, that gentle smile wider than ever. "Welcome, Frank. Welcome to the truth." Frank felt the last of his will slip away as the entity embraced him. His mind expanded, filled with alien thoughts and impossible knowledge. He saw the world as it really was, a thin shell of reality stretched over an infinite abyss of chaos and hunger. And now, thanks to Preacher, that shell had been broken. The eclipse ended, the sun returning to normal. But the prison was forever changed. To outside observers, nothing seemed wrong. The inmates were model prisoners, the guards efficient and quiet. Inspectors who came to investigate the unusual reports found nothing amiss, though they always left with slight headaches and troubling dreams. But at night, when the shadows grew long, you could see the truth. The prison was no longer entirely in this world. It existed partially in that other place, that dark dimension where the entity dwelled. The inmates and guards were no longer entirely human, but vessels for something ancient and terrible. And at the center of it all was Preacher, still giving his sermons, still gathering new converts from each batch of incoming prisoners. His congregation grew larger every day, spreading beyond the prison walls as inmates were released, carrying the entity's influence into the wider world. Frank still worked his shifts, still did his rounds, but he was no longer Frank. He was part of something greater now, a single cell in a vast organism that was slowly consuming reality from the inside out. And sometimes, in quiet moments, the small part of Frank that still existed somewhere deep inside would try to scream a warning, but all that came out was that gentle smile. The transformation of Riverbend State Penitentiary was complete. It had become a beacon, a lighthouse calling to things that should never be called. And soon, Preacher promised, there would be more beacons. More prisons, more hospitals, more schools. Places where despair and suffering had worn the walls of reality thin. The entity was patient. It had waited eons, and it could wait longer. Each new convert was another anchor point, another door. And when enough doors were open, when enough of humanity had been converted, it would no longer need to hide in shadows. It would walk freely in the light, and the world would smile gently as it was devoured. Diana, who had once been a nurse, now worked with mechanical precision, preparing inmates for their transformation. She no longer remembered her old life, her old concerns. She existed only to serve, to spread the truth that Preacher had shown her. And Frank, who had once tried so hard to stop it, now stood guard over something far more terrible than any human criminal. He protected the secret, ensured that no one interfered with Preacher's work. Sometimes, visitors would comment on how peaceful the prison seemed, how well-behaved the inmates were. Frank would smile that gentle smile and agree. Yes, it was peaceful. Yes, the inmates were transformed. If only they knew what they had been transformed into. The symbol that had been carved into so many arms had become the unofficial emblem of Riverbend. It appeared in graffiti, in artwork, even in the way the prisoners arranged their meal trays. It was spreading, a viral sigil that prepared minds for contact with the entity. And in his cell, which was now more of a shrine than a prison room, Preacher continued his work. He no longer needed to eat or sleep. He existed purely as a conduit, a living portal between worlds. Through him, the entity whispered its promises to new converts, showed them visions of the world to come. A world without violence, without chaos, without free will. A world of gentle smiles and glassy eyes. A world where humanity was nothing more than a costume worn by something infinitely older and hungrier. The guards, who still resisted, the new inmates who hadn't yet attended preachers' sermons, they were becoming fewer every day. The entity was patient but inexorable. It could wait for them to sleep, to dream, to let their guard down for just a moment. That's all it needed. A moment of weakness, a crack in their mental defenses, and it would pour in like water, finding every gap, every crevice, until there was nowhere left that wasn't filled with its presence. Frank stood at his post, watching the yard where inmates moved in perfect synchronization, like a single organism with many bodies. He no longer remembered why he had once found this disturbing. It was beautiful, this unity, this surrender of the chaotic self to the ordered whole. Tomorrow, another batch of new inmates would arrive. Fresh minds to convert, fresh vessels to fill. Preacher would welcome them with his gentle smile and soft words, and they would resist at first. They always did. But in the end, they all joined the congregation. They all opened themselves to the truth. They all became doors for the thing that waited in the shadows, growing stronger with each passing day, preparing for the moment when it would no longer need to hide. And somewhere, deep in the part of Frank that still remembered being human, a tiny voice continued its futile warning. Don't listen to preacher. Don't look at the shadows. Don't complete the symbol. But the voice grew weaker every day, drowned out by the harmonious whispers of the congregation, all speaking with one voice, all serving one purpose, all smiling that same terrible, gentle smile. Joe Brennan sat in his worn leather recliner, the glass of whiskey trembling slightly in his weathered hand. Across from him, the young journalist had her recorder running, its red light blinking like a tiny eye in the dim light of his living room. She'd come to interview him about his 40 years as a corrections officer, but Joe knew she wanted to hear about one thing in particular: the riot of 1983 at Coldwater Maximum Security Prison. Everyone thinks they know what happened that night, Joe said, his voice rough from decades of cigarettes and shouting orders. The official report says it was a gang dispute that got out of hand. 3 days of chaos, 17 dead, 43 injured. The governor called in the National Guard and order was restored. End of story. He took a long sip of whiskey. But that's not the real story. Not even close. The journalist, Sarah, leaned forward. What really happened? Joe was quiet for a moment, his eyes unfocused, looking at something far beyond the walls of his small apartment. You have to understand, Coldwater in the 80s was a different world. We had 3,000 inmates packed into a facility built for 1,500. No cameras except at the main gates. No computers. Just men with keys and clubs trying to keep the lid on a pressure cooker. He set down his glass and pulled out an old photo album, its pages yellow with age. He flipped to a group photo of guards in uniform, pointing to a young man with dark hair and a confident smile. That's me, 1979. I was 25, thought I was tough as nails. This here, he pointed to a mountain of a man standing next to him. That's Officer Daniel Murphy. 6'5", 300 pounds of muscle. We called him Murph. Best partner I ever had. He died in the riot. The report says he was beaten to death by inmates, but that's not what happened to him. Joe flipped the page to another photo. A massive black man in prison orange, arms like tree trunks standing between two nervous-looking guards. And this is Lawrence "Tank" Williams, doing life for killing 3 men in a bar fight. They say he broke their necks with his bare hands. Tank ran D-Block like his personal kingdom. even the Aryan Brotherhood and the Mexican Mafia gave him a wide berth. He had this presence about him, like a force of nature. When Tank walked into a room, everyone noticed. Sarah studied the photo. Even in the faded image, Tank's eyes seemed to bore into her. Was he involved in the riot? Joe laughed bitterly. Involved? Tank was the only reason any of us survived. But I'm getting ahead of myself. He closed the album and leaned back. It started on October 13th, 1983, Thursday night. I was working the graveyard shift with Murphy. Everything seemed normal at first. Did our counts, did our rounds, but around midnight we started noticing something odd. The prison was too quiet. Too quiet? You work in a prison long enough, you learn the rhythms. There's always noise, snoring, toilets flushing, someone yelling in their sleep. But that night, it was like someone had hit a mute button. Murphy and I did a walking count through D Block, and every single inmate was awake, sitting on their bunks, staring at nothing. Joe's hand started trembling more noticeably. He gripped the whiskey glass to steady it. We get to Tank's cell, and he's standing at his door. He looks at us and says, "You need to leave. Now. Take all the guards and leave." I laugh it off, thinking he's trying to set up something. But Tank grabs the bars, and I'd never seen him look scared before. He says, "They're coming through tonight. The deal's been made. Once it starts, I can't protect you." Who was coming through? Joe was quiet for a long moment. That's the thing. I don't think who is the right question. I think the right question is what. He got up and walked to a closet, pulling out a battered cardboard box. From it, he withdrew several items: a guard's logbook, some photographs, and what looked like a piece of fabric with dark stains. I kept these. Probably shouldn't have, but I needed proof that I didn't imagine it all. This is Murphy's logbook from that night. Look at his last entry. Sarah read aloud. 12:47 a.m. Something wrong in C block. Inmates drawing symbols on walls with their own blood. Temperature dropping despite heating system running full. Sounds coming from the walls themselves. Requesting immediate backup, and the entry ended mid-sentence. Murphy went to check C block alone while I stayed in D, Joe continued. That was the last time I saw him normal. 20 minutes later, all hell broke loose. Joe pulled out one of the photographs. It showed a prison wall covered in strange symbols drawn in what looked like blood. The symbols seemed to writhe and move even in the still photograph, making Sarah's eyes water to look at them. The riot started in C block, Joe said. But it wasn't like any riot I'd seen before or since. The inmates weren't fighting each other or trying to take hostages. They were building something. They'd torn apart their cells and were using the materials to construct this structure in the middle of the block. It looked like an altar or a doorway made of twisted metal and concrete. I tried to call for backup, but the radios were dead, the phone lines were cut. We were isolated. That's when I heard Murphy screaming. Not the kind of scream you make when you're hurt. The kind you make when your mind breaks. Joe took another drink. A longer one this time. I ran to C block, and what I saw, he shook his head. The inmates were standing in a circle around their makeshift structure. They were chanting in some language I'd never heard, and in the center, where Murphy should have been, there was something else. It had Murphy's uniform, Murphy's shape, but it wasn't Murphy anymore. Its skin was moving, rippling like water. And its eyes, God, its eyes were black holes. Not black-colored, actual holes in reality. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Brennan, are you sure you didn't—" "I know how it sounds," Joe interrupted. "But I'm telling you what I saw. And I wasn't the only one. Every guard who survived that night saw things. Most won't talk about it." The ones who did were labeled crazy, pensioned off quietly. He pulled out another photograph, this one showing the aftermath of the riot. Bodies covered in sheets, National Guard soldiers in the background. The thing that used to be Murphy started changing the other inmates, not infecting them exactly, more like upgrading them. They'd touch an inmate, and that person would start transforming, growing extra limbs, eyes opening in places eyes shouldn't be, mouths full of teeth that no human should have. And they kept building that structure, making it bigger, more complex. That's when Tank acted. He gathered the inmates from D Block who hadn't been affected yet. About 30 of the toughest bastards you'd ever meet. Gang leaders, killers, men with nothing to lose. And he led them into C Block like an army. Joe pulled out the stained fabric. This is a piece of Tank's shirt from that night. That's not blood on it. I don't know what it is. It's never dried, never faded. Sometimes it moves when I'm not looking directly at it. Tank and his men fought those things for 3 straight days. Not the transformed inmates. They were trying to save them. They fought the things that were coming through the structure. Because that's what it was. A doorway. And things were coming through from the other side. What kind of things? Joe's eyes went distant again. Imagine if someone took apart different animals and put them back together wrong. Things with too many joints, bending in ways that hurt to watch. Skin that wasn't quite solid, like it was still deciding what shape to be. And they were hungry. God, they were so hungry. Tank held the line at the entrance to C Block. For 3 days and 3 nights, he and his men kept those things from spreading to the rest of the prison. I saw him rip one of those creatures in half with his bare hands. I saw him throw another one back through the doorway they'd built. The man was magnificent and terrifying. But he was losing. One by one, his men were being killed or transformed. By the morning of the 3rd day, it was just Tank and 5 others. That's when he made the choice. Joe stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the night sky. Tank told me to get all the remaining guards and unaffected inmates to the far side of the prison. Said he was going to end it. I argued, but he just smiled. First time I'd ever seen him smile, and said, "This is what I was meant for, boss. This is why I'm here." We evacuated everyone we could. 20 minutes later, there was an explosion that shook the entire prison. When the National Guard arrived an hour later, C Block was gone. Not destroyed, gone. Where it should have been, there was just a perfectly smooth crater, like something had scooped out that section of reality. Sarah frowned. But the official report says C Block was damaged but rebuilt. Joe laughed. They built a new C Block, yes, but not in the same spot. That crater is still there, covered by a concrete cap. They tell people it's a storage area now, but no one goes near it. Sometimes, on quiet nights, you can still hear things moving underneath. He returned to his chair and pulled out one final item from the box, a cassette tape. This is a recording from the prison's backup security system. The main system was fried, but this old analog recorder in the warden's office kept running. Listen. He put the tape in an old player and pressed play. At first, there was just static. Then, faintly, they could hear chanting in that unknown language. The chanting grew louder, joined by sounds that didn't seem possible, screams that went on longer than human lungs could sustain, wet, tearing noises, and underneath it all something that sounded like massive wings beating. Then, Tank's voice, clear and strong. "I know what you are. I know why you're here. But this ain't your world. Go back to the dark and take your servants with you." There was a response in a voice that didn't sound like it came from any human throat. The words were English, but wrong, like they were being forced through organs never meant for speech. "The door is open. The pact is made. This world is ours to harvest." "Then you'll have to go through me," Tank replied. The recording dissolved into static after that. Joe turned off the player. That's the last anyone heard of Tank. When the guard cleared the prison, they found 17 bodies that matched the official count. But Tank wasn't among them. Neither was Murphy, or the thing Murphy had become. And 23 inmates from C Block were never accounted for. What do you think happened to them? Joe was quiet for a long time. "I think Tank took them with him. Wherever that doorway led, I think he went through it. Not to explore, but to make sure it stayed closed from the other side. He became the door's guardian, keeping those things from coming back." But that's not the end of the story. See, every year on October 13th, something happens at Coldwater. They don't publicize it, but guards talk. Inmates in what they built where C Block used to be report strange dreams. They see a massive black man fighting endless horrors in a place that doesn't follow the rules of our world. They see him standing guard at a doorway, keeping things from pushing through. And sometimes, just sometimes, guards on the night shift report seeing Tank in the hallways. Not a ghost exactly, more like an echo or a projection. He appears to new guards, especially ones working C Block. He tells them the same thing. Watch the corners. Listen to the walls. If you hear the chanting, evacuate the block. And whatever you do, don't let them complete the doorway. Sarah looked skeptical. "You're saying this still happens?" Joe nodded. 3 years ago, a group of inmates in C Block started exhibiting the same behavior as in '83. Staying awake all night, drawing symbols, speaking in tongues. The guards remembered Tank's warning. They evacuated the block and called in a riot team. They found the inmates building another structure, same design as the original. They destroyed it before it was completed, and the inmates had no memory of what they'd been doing. Last year, same thing, and the year before that. It's like something keeps trying to open that door again, and Tank's warning is the only thing that stops it. Joe pulled out a newer photograph, dated just a month ago. It showed a section of prison wall with writing scratched into it. Tank still holds the line. This appeared in C Block last month. The handwriting matched Murphy's according to the old employment records. Murphy, who supposedly died in 1983. Sarah examined all the evidence Joe had presented. "This is incredible. Why haven't you gone public with this?" Joe laughed. "With what? A story about interdimensional monsters and a heroic inmate who might be guarding a doorway to hell? They'd lock me up. Besides, the people who need to know. Every guard at Coldwater hears the real story eventually. They know to watch for the signs. But there's one more thing," Joe said, his voice dropping. "Remember how I said the deal had been made? Tank mentioned a pact?" Sarah nodded. "I did some research over the years. In 1983, just before the riot, the prison received a new chaplain, Father Ernst Kellerman. He lasted exactly 1 month before requesting a transfer. But during that month, he held special services for inmates interested in alternative spirituality." Joe pulled out a photocopy of an old document. "This is from Kellerman's personal effects, found after he died in 1995. It's written in Latin, German, and something else. The parts that have been translated talk about opening the way for the old ones and preparing vessels for the harvest. You think the chaplain caused the riot? I think he started something he couldn't control. And I think there are others like him. Every few years, someone tries to open that doorway again. Sometimes it's an inmate who finds old books in the library. Sometimes it's a guard who gets curious about the stories. Sometimes it's someone on the outside, pulling strings." Joe stood up, signaling the interview was coming to an end. "Coldwater is a battleground, miss. Has been since 1983. Tank understood that. He sacrificed himself to keep something terrible from entering our world. and he's still fighting, somewhere on the other side of that doorway. As Sarah gathered her things, Joe handed her a business card. "This is my nephew. He works at Coldwater now, just like his dad did, and his grandfather before him. Family tradition. If you want to verify my story, talk to him. He's seen Tank twice, once in 2018, once last year. Both times Tank saved his life by warning him about inmates who were starting to turn." Sarah looked at the card, then back at Joe. "Why are you telling me this now?" Joe walked her to the door. "Because October 13th is coming up again. 40 years since the riot. The guards at Coldwater are nervous. They're seeing more signs, more symptoms. Something big is coming, and I want someone to know the truth in case Tank can't hold them back this time." As Sarah left, Joe called after her. "One more thing. If you do go to Coldwater and you see a massive black man in old prison clothes standing in the shadows, don't run. Just listen to what he tells you. Tank's never been wrong." That night, Joe sat alone in his apartment, looking through the old photos one more time. He stopped at a picture he hadn't shown Sarah, one taken by a crime scene photographer after the riot. In the background, barely visible in the crater where C Block had been, there was a figure. It could have been a shadow or a trick of the light, but Joe knew better. It was Tank, standing at the edge of the void, looking back one last time before stepping through to fight a war that would never end. Joe raised his glass in a toast to the empty room. "Here's to you, Tank. Keep holding that line." Outside, October wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, Joe could swear he heard chanting. The interview was published 3 weeks later, on October 12th. Sarah had done her research, verified what she could. She'd even visited Coldwater and spoken to Joe's nephew, who confirmed seeing Tank's apparition. On October 13th, 2023, exactly 40 years after the original riot, Coldwater Maximum Security Prison experienced what officials called a minor disturbance. Inmates in C Block had begun showing signs of coordinated behavior. Guards, remembering the warnings passed down through the decades, evacuated the block immediately. When the tactical team entered, they found 37 inmates unconscious, arranged in a circle around a partially constructed structure made from torn-apart bunks and broken concrete. The structure was demolished, the inmates were transferred to different facilities, and the incident was classified. But one detail never made it into any report. When the tactical team first entered C Block before they found the inmates, they encountered someone else. A massive black man in decades-old prison clothing, standing guard over the unconscious inmates. He spoke only once. "They tried to force it open. I stopped them. But they're getting stronger. The door won't hold forever." Then he vanished, leaving behind only the smell of sulfur and the echo of distant screaming from somewhere beyond the walls of reality. Joe's nephew called him that night to report what had happened. "He saved us again," the nephew said. "Tank saved us all." Joe nodded, unsurprised. He always does. But for how much longer? That was the question that haunted everyone who knew the truth about Coldwater. Tank had held the line for 40 years, fighting a war in a place human minds couldn't comprehend. But even legends get tired. Even heroes fall eventually. And somewhere, in the spaces between spaces, in a realm where physics went to die, Tank Williams continued his eternal vigil. Not because he had to, but because he chose to. Because sometimes, one man's sacrifice is all that stands between the world and the hungry darkness that waits behind reality's thin walls. The doorway he guarded pulsed with malevolent life, testing his will every second of every day. And behind it, things that had never been human and never could be human, waited with infinite patience for the moment his guard would drop. But Tank had made a promise 40 years ago. He'd told those things they'd have to go through him. And Lawrence "Tank" Williams had never broken a promise. Not in life. Not in whatever came after. Not ever. The guards at Coldwater still tell his story to new recruits. Not as a ghost story, but as a reminder. A reminder that sometimes the monsters are real. Sometimes the walls between worlds grow thin. And sometimes the only thing standing between humanity and annihilation is one man who refused to let the darkness win. They always end the story the same way. Tank still holds the line. And in the depths of C-Block, where reality is thinnest, where the walls whisper and shadows move on their own, that statement is more than just words. It's a prayer. It's a promise. It's the truth. Joe died 2 years after giving that interview, peacefully in his sleep. At his funeral, his nephew swore that just before they closed the casket, he saw something impossible. There, standing in the back of the funeral home, was Tank Williams. Not the apparition that haunted Coldwater, but what looked like the real man, solid and present. Tank nodded once, a gesture of respect for a guard who'd kept the secret and honored the sacrifice. Then he was gone, returned to his post in that space between worlds. The nephew kept Joe's box of evidence, adding to it over the years. More photos of writing on walls, more recordings of unexplained sounds, more testimony from guards who'd seen Tank's warnings save lives. And every October 13th, without fail, something tries to open the doorway at Coldwater Maximum Security Prison. And every October 13th, without fail, Tank Williams stops it. How long can one man, even one as strong as Tank, hold back the darkness? No one knows. But as long as guards remember his story, as long as they heed his warnings, as long as they evacuate C-Block when the chanting starts, Tank's sacrifice continues to mean something. In a world full of forgotten heroes, Lawrence "Tank" Williams stands eternal watch over a doorway that must never open. And somewhere in the void between realities, surrounded by horrors that would shatter human minds, Tank Williams smiles that same rare smile he gave Joe 40 years ago. Marcus Washington had been working at Pine Ridge Correctional Facility for 12 years, and he thought he'd seen everything. Gang wars, suicide attempts, escape plots, nothing surprised him anymore. But that changed the day they brought in Edgar "Spider" Cromwell. Spider arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning in November, transferred from Eastgate Penitentiary 3 states away. The transfer paperwork was oddly sparse, just the basics. Edgar Cromwell, age 31, serving 25 to life for second-degree murder. No gang affiliations, no special medical needs, no behavioral incidents in the past year. Clean as a whistle. But there was something else. Something that made Marcus pause. The transfer had been expedited, signed by the warden of Eastgate himself, with a handwritten note at the bottom. Immediate transfer required, no delays. That kind of urgency usually meant an inmate was in danger, or was a danger. Looking at Spider, Marcus couldn't figure out which. Marcus was assigned to process him. Spider was a small man, maybe 5'6", thin to the point of being gaunt. His arms and neck were covered in intricate tattoos that looked like spider webs, hence the nickname. But it was his eyes that made Marcus pause, pale gray, almost silver, and they never seemed to blink. When he did blink, it was deliberate, mechanical, like he had to remind himself to do it. "Welcome to Pine Ridge," Marcus said, going through the standard intake procedure. "Stay out of trouble and we'll get along fine." Spider smiled, revealing teeth that were unnaturally white and perfectly straight. "I always stay out of trouble, Officer Washington. Trouble tends to find others around me, though." There was something in the way he said it that made Marcus's skin crawl. Not a threat, exactly, but a statement of fact. like saying water is wet or the sky is blue. And the way he'd known Marcus's name before seeing his badge, that was unsettling. During the strip search, Marcus noticed something disturbing. What he'd thought were tattoos weren't ink at all. They were scars. Thousands of tiny, deliberate scars forming an intricate web pattern across Spider's entire body. Some were old, white with age. Others looked fresh, still pink and raised. The pattern was so precise it must have taken years to create. "Interesting body art," Marcus commented, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Each line tells a story," Spider replied. "Each intersection marks a life that intersected with mine." "Would you like to know how many intersections there are, Officer Washington?" Marcus didn't answer, but he couldn't help counting. Dozens of intersections, maybe hundreds. Spider was assigned to cell Block B, general population. His cellmate was a man named Tommy Chen, doing 5 years for armed robbery. Tommy was known as a quiet inmate who kept to himself and just wanted to do his time. Marcus figured they'd be a good match. As Marcus escorted Spider to his cell, they passed through the different sections of the prison. Something strange happened. The noise level dropped wherever Spider walked. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Card games paused. Even the most hardened criminals seemed to sense something, turning to watch him pass with expressions of unconscious unease. In the maximum security wing, a lifer named Big John, who hadn't shown fear of anything in his 20 years inside, actually stepped back into his cell as Spider walked by. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Big John's face went pale. "You know him?" Marcus asked Big John later. "Never seen him before," Big John replied, his voice shaky. "But I've dreamed about him, we all have. The man made of webs, walking through the walls." He paused, then added quietly, "He's been in every prison, Officer Washington, every single one, just wearing different faces." The first week passed without incident. Spider attended meals, went to his work assignment in the laundry, and spent his rec time sitting alone in the yard watching everyone else. He never caused problems, never got into arguments. But Marcus noticed something odd. Wherever Spider went, other inmates gave him a wide berth. Even the toughest gang members seemed to unconsciously avoid him. Marcus started documenting the strange behaviors. Inmates would walk the long way around the yard to avoid passing near Spider. During meals, the tables around him would empty one by one, until he sat in a bubble of isolation. In the shower room, no one would use the stalls near him. It was Deputy Warden Hayes who first brought up the official concerns. Hayes was a 20-year veteran, tough but fair, and he had good instincts about inmates. "That new transfer, Cromwell," Hayes said during a staff meeting. "Something's off about him. I've been making calls to Eastgate, trying to get more information, but they're being cagey. All they'll say is that the transfer was necessary for institutional safety. He hasn't caused any problems," the warden pointed out. "That's what worries me," Hayes replied. "I've seen his type before. The quiet ones who smile while everything burns around them. I want increased surveillance on him. And Marcus, since you processed him, I want you to be his primary officer. Watch him. Document everything." Marcus decided to do some digging of his own. He had a buddy who worked at Eastgate, a guard named Luis Rodriguez. He called Luis that evening. "Spider Cromwell?" Luis's voice changed the moment Marcus mentioned the name. "Jesus, they sent him to you? I'm sorry, man. I'm so fucking sorry." "Why? What happened at Eastgate?" There was a long pause. Marcus could hear Luis breathing heavily, like he was having a panic attack just thinking about it. "Officially, nothing. Unofficially, in the 3 years Spider was here, 17 inmates died. Natural causes, suicides, accidents, Nothing that could be traced back to him, but everyone knew. We all knew. Knew what? That he was responsible somehow. The deaths always happened to people who crossed him, disrespected him, or just looked at him wrong. But there was never any evidence, never any witnesses. The man's like a poison that spreads through the prison. Give me details, Luis. All right. First one was a guy named Rodriguez. No relation. Big tough guy. Tried to extort Spider for protection money his first week. 3 days later, Rodriguez starts screaming that there are spiders under his skin. Guards think he's having a psychotic break. He claws his own arms open, trying to get them out. Dies from blood loss. Autopsy found nothing. No drugs, no spiders, nothing. Luis continued, his voice getting quieter. Then there was Williams. Took Spider's dessert in the cafeteria just to show dominance. That night, Williams starts coughing up what looks like spider silk. Doctors can't explain it. He suffocates on it. Again, autopsy finds nothing abnormal. That's impossible. That's what we said, but it kept happening. And then the dreams started. Dreams? Everyone who interacted with Spider started having the same nightmare. A giant web spanning between dimensions, and Spider sitting at the center like some kind of god, pulling strings. In the dreams, he'd show you your death. And then it would happen exactly like he showed you. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Why didn't anyone do anything? What could we do? He never broke a single rule, never raised his voice, never threw a punch. He just existed, and people around him died. The warden finally had enough when Officer Patel died. A guard died? Patel tried to search Spider's cell, looking for contraband, anything to transfer him out. He found some old books, weird symbols drawn under the bunk. That night, Patel's wife found him in their garage, covered in spider webs. Thousands of them. He'd been dead for hours, but the spiders were still spinning, still covering him. After the call, Marcus couldn't sleep. He went back to the prison, pulled up the security footage of Spider's activities. What he saw in the enhancement disturbed him deeply. Spider had a way of talking to people, leaning in close, whispering things that the cameras couldn't pick up. And after these conversations, the inmates would change. They'd become withdrawn, anxious, paranoid. But there was something else. When Marcus enhanced the footage and slowed it down, he could see something impossible. During these conversations, Spider's shadow didn't match his body. It had too many arms, too many legs. It moved independently, reaching out toward the person he was talking to. 2 weeks after Spider's arrival, the first incident happened. Tommy Chen, Spider's cellmate, was found in the shower room at 3 a.m., convulsing on the floor. Marcus was the first responder. Tommy's eyes were rolled back, showing only white, and he was speaking in a language Marcus didn't recognize. It sounded like clicking and chittering, like the sound insects make. The medical team managed to stabilize him, but he remained catatonic, his eyes wide with terror, unable to speak normally. When he finally recovered enough to communicate, all he would say was, "Hey, the spiders. They're inside me, eating their way out, making room for more." Marcus visited Tommy in the medical wing. The man was restrained to prevent him from clawing at his skin. His arms were covered in scratches, some so deep they required stitches. "What did Spider do to you?" Marcus asked. Tommy's eyes focused on him for a moment. "He showed me the truth. We're all just egg sacs, Officer Washington. Walking, talking egg sacs. And when the time is right, we'll all hatch." The medical examination found nothing wrong with him physically, but Tommy had to be transferred to the psychiatric ward. The doctors were baffled. His brain scans showed unusual activity in regions that should have been dormant, as if parts of his brain that humans don't use had suddenly come alive. Spider got a new cellmate, a tough guy named Rick Morrison. Rick was doing 15 years for aggravated assault, had been in and out of prison his whole life. He wasn't afraid of anything or anyone. Rick lasted 8 days. Marcus was doing his morning rounds when he found Rick standing in his cell, perfectly still, facing the wall. Spider was sitting on his bunk, reading that same old leather-bound book. "Morrison, you okay?" Marcus called out. Rick didn't respond. Marcus opened the cell and approached him. Rick's eyes were open but unseeing. He was breathing, but barely. On the wall in front of him, drawn in what looked like blood but was too dark, too thick, was a massive web pattern with Rick at the center. "He's been standing there all night," Spider said without looking up from his book. "He asked to see the truth. I obliged." Marcus called for medical, but when they tried to move Rick, he started screaming. Not words, just a continuous inhuman shriek that went on until his voice gave out. They sedated him, but the moment he woke up, the screaming continued. Rick hung himself with his bedsheet that night. His suicide note was just one sentence, repeated over and over in increasingly erratic handwriting. "He showed me what's coming. He showed me what's coming. He showed me what's coming." Marcus confronted Spider after Rick's death, finding him in his cell reading that same book. Up close, Marcus could see the pages were filled with symbols and diagrams that hurt to look at, that seemed to move when you weren't focusing directly on them. Some of the symbols looked like spiders, but with too many legs, too many eyes, existing in too many dimensions at once. 2 cellmates in 3 weeks, Marcus said. "That's quite a coincidence." Spider looked up, that perpetual smile on his face. "I tried to warn them, Officer Washington. Some people can't handle the truth about reality. Their minds break like glass, just like yours will when the time comes. Is that a threat?" Spider stood up, moving to the bars of his cell. Up close, Marcus could see that the scars on his skin were moving slightly, pulsing with his heartbeat. No, not with his heartbeat. With something else's rhythm. Not a threat, a prophecy. "You see, Officer Washington, we're not alone in here. Not in this cell, not in this prison, not in this world. There are things that live in the corners of our vision, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the moments between sleep and waking. I've seen them, I've spoken to them, I've become them. And once you know they're there, they know you're there too. You're insane." "Am I? Tell me, Officer Washington, have you been sleeping well lately? Any strange dreams? Maybe you've been seeing things out of the corner of your eye. Little movements that shouldn't be there? Feeling like something's crawling on you when nothing's there?" The truth was, Marcus had been having nightmares since Spider arrived. Dreams of being wrapped in webs, of things with too many legs crawling over his body, into his mouth, his nose, his ears. And yes, he'd been seeing things, quick movements in his peripheral vision that disappeared when he turned to look. "That's fear and suggestion," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Spider laughed, a sound like rustling leaves or skittering insects. "Keep telling yourself that. But you might want to check on Officer Martinez. He's been looking pale lately. Check his neck, behind his left ear. You'll see the mark." Marcus left, but Spider's words stuck with him. Officer Martinez had been acting strange. Jumpy, paranoid, constantly scratching at his arms and neck. Marcus found him in the break room, and sure enough, behind his left ear was a small mark that looked like a bite, surrounded by thin red lines spreading under the skin like veins. "Martinez, you okay?" Martinez turned, and his eyes were bloodshot, pupils dilated. "They're inside me, Marcus. I can feel them moving. Spider said they'd hatch soon, said I'd be the first of many." The next day, Martinez didn't show up for work. They found him in his apartment, dead from what the coroner initially ruled a heart attack. But his body was covered in tiny bite marks, and his apartment was infested with spiders. Thousands of them, species that weren't native to the area, species that some experts couldn't even identify. Some had too many legs. Some had human-looking eyes. Some seemed to phase in and out of visibility. The coroner amended the cause of death to unknown after finding that Martinez's blood had been replaced with something that looked like blood but had a different chemical composition. It moved on its own under the microscope, forming web-like patterns. Deputy Hayes called Marcus into his office after Martinez's funeral. "I've been doing more research on Cromwell," Hayes said, spreading files across his desk. "This goes back further than Eastgate. Before that, he was at Black Rock Federal Prison. Before that, Millbrook State. Every place he's been, the same pattern. Deaths, suicides, psychological breakdowns, and always spiders. How far back does it go?" Hayes pulled out a photograph. It showed a prison cell, every surface covered in spider webs so thick you couldn't see the walls. This was Cromwell's cell at Black Rock. They found it like this after he was transferred. The webs appeared overnight. When they tried to clear them, they found bodies. Bodies? 3 inmates who'd gone missing over the previous year. They were wrapped in the webs, preserved like they'd died yesterday. The coroner couldn't determine cause of death. They just stopped living. But here's the really fucked up part. They were still conscious. Their eyes tracked movement. They tried to speak, but no sound came out. They were alive, but not alive, suspended between states. Marcus stared at the photo. In the center of the web, barely visible, was what looked like a door or portal made entirely of spider silk. What is he? I don't know, but I found something else. Cromwell's first arrest was in 1996. He was 15 years old, killed his entire family. Parents, 2 sisters, grandmother. The police report. Hayes pulled out another file. The house was full of spider webs. The bodies were drained of blood, but there were no wounds, just tiny puncture marks. And there's more. Hayes spread out more photographs going back decades. 1983, a man matching Spider's description was arrested in Montana. Different name, but same MO. 1971, same thing in Florida. 1959, California. 1943, New York. Always the same age, always the same appearance, always the same pattern of deaths. He was 15 in 1996. That would make him 47 now, but he looks 30. He's looked 30 in every photo for the past 60 years at least. And look at this. Hayes showed him a photograph from 1910. It was a group photo of prisoners at a chain gang. In the back row, partially obscured but still visible, was a man who looked exactly like Spider Cromwell. It could be a relative, an ancestor, could be, or it could be that Edgar Cromwell isn't human. At least, not anymore. I found one more thing. A journal entry from a prison chaplain in 1887. Listen to this. There is a prisoner here who calls himself the Spider. He speaks of walking between worlds, of serving things that existed before God said, "Let there be light." The other prisoners die in their sleep, covered in webs. I fear he is not of God's creation, but something far older and more terrible. The warden plans to hang him tomorrow, but I fear death will not stop him. He told me yesterday that he has died 1,000 times and will die 1,000 more, but always he returns, for he is the door through which they enter our world. The entry ends there. The chaplain was found dead the next morning, his body completely desiccated. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Spider, about the deaths, about the spiders. He got up to get a glass of water and saw his reflection in the bathroom mirror. For just a moment, his reflection seemed to have too many arms. Around 3 a.m., unable to rest, he decided to do an unofficial patrol of the prison. He found himself outside Spider's cell. Spider was awake, sitting on his bunk, that leather book open in his lap. He was writing in it with what looked like a quill pen, though where he'd gotten such a thing in prison was a mystery. The ink looked dark and thick, almost like blood. "Can't sleep, Officer Washington?" Spider asked, without looking up. "What are you?" Spider closed the book and looked at Marcus. In the dim light, his eyes seemed to reflect like a cat's, but with multiple pupils in each iris. "I'm what happens when someone makes a deal they shouldn't. When someone trades their humanity for knowledge and power. I'm a cautionary tale that nobody learns from. The spiders are my children in a way, or maybe I'm theirs. It's hard to remember which came first. You see, Officer Washington, there are things that exist parallel to our world. Things that have been here longer than humans, longer than Earth itself. They exist in the spaces between spaces, in dimensions that intersect with ours at certain points. They're always looking for ways in, for hosts, for servants. In 1847, I was dying. I was a different person then, with a different name, rotting in a cell for a crime I didn't commit. I prayed to anything that would listen. Something answered." Spider stood up and moved to the bars. As he did, Marcus saw something impossible. Spider's shadow didn't match his movements. It had too many arms, too many legs. It looked like a massive spider made of darkness, but also something worse. Something that hurt to perceive directly. They saved me, gave me immortality of a sort. But there was a price. I became a doorway, a breeding ground. Every person I touch, every person who gets too close, they risk infection. The spiders lay their eggs in minds, in souls, in the very fabric of reality around them. Most people can't handle it. They break. Why are you telling me this? Because you're already infected, Officer Washington. You have been since the day you processed me. Feel your neck, right side, just below your hairline. Marcus reached up and felt the back of his neck. There was a small bump, like a mosquito bite, but it pulsed with its own heartbeat. As he touched it, he felt something move under his skin. "That's an egg sac," Spider said casually. "In about 3 days, it'll hatch. Tiny spiders will burrow into your brain, your spine, your organs. But these aren't normal spiders. They exist partially in other dimensions. They'll remake you from the inside out. If you're strong, you might survive like I did, become like me. If not, well, you saw what happened to Martinez." Marcus stumbled backward, his hand clutching his neck. "You're lying." "Am I?" "Go ahead, check the mirror. Check under ultraviolet light if you want. You'll see them moving under your skin. You'll see the web they're building inside you." Marcus ran to the guard station, grabbed a flashlight with a UV setting. In the bathroom mirror, under the purple light, he saw it. A network of dark lines spreading from the bump on his neck, like veins, but moving, pulsing, alive. The pattern looked exactly like the scars on Spider's body. He returned to Spider's cell, his service weapon drawn. "Fix this, now," Spider laughed. "I can't. Once they're in, but I can tell you how to survive it. How to live with it. How to become something more than human. Tell me." "First, you have to feed them. They like fear, terror, despair. That's why people around me die. I direct the spiders to them, let them feed on their terror as they realize what's happening. It keeps my children satisfied. Without food, they'll consume you from the inside." "You're a monster?" "Yes, but I'm a living monster, which is more than Tommy or Rick or Martinez can say. And I've been alive for almost 2 centuries. I've seen empires rise and fall. I've walked through wars and plagues. I am eternal." Marcus's hand was shaking. He could feel movement under his skin now, a crawling sensation spreading through his body. "There's another way," Spider said. "You could kill me. My death might sever the connection, might kill the spiders inside you, or it might release them all at once, turning this entire prison into a nest. Thousands of infected, all at once. 50-50 chance." Marcus aimed the gun at Spider's head. His finger was on the trigger. "Of course," Spider continued. "If you shoot me, you'll go to prison yourself. And who will believe your story? A guard who killed an inmate because he thought he was infected with magic spiders. You'll end up in a padded cell next to Tommy." The gun wavered. "Or," Spider said, "you could accept what you're becoming, help me. Bring me the right victims, the ones who deserve it. The child killers, the rapists. Let my children feed on them. In return, I'll teach you to control the spiders, to use them. You'll never age, never die. You'll be like me. I'd rather die. Would you? What about your wife, Marcus? Your 2 kids, little Sarah and James? What happens to them when you're gone? Who pays the mortgage, puts food on the table? Or worse, what if the spiders decide to visit them after you're dead? They're drawn to blood relatives. Your children would make excellent hosts." Marcus lowered the gun. Spider had done his research, knew about his family. "That's better," Spider said. "Now, your first lesson. The spiders respond to will. Focus on them. Feel them moving. Now, command them to be still." Marcus concentrated, and to his horror and amazement, the crawling sensation stopped. "Good, you're a natural. With practice, you can make them do much more. They can be your eyes and ears, your weapons, your salvation. You can walk through walls like I do, exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. I won't kill for you. You won't have to. Just bring me the right people. I'll do the rest. And in return, your family stays safe, and you stay sane. Well, sane enough." Marcus left Spider's cell and went to the bathroom, where he vomited until there was nothing left. He looked at himself in the mirror. Already, he looked different. His eyes had a grayish tint, and his skin was paler. When he blinked, he could swear he saw multiple realities overlapping for a split second. The next day, he called in sick, and the day after. On the 3rd day, Deputy Hayes came to his apartment. "Jesus, Marcus, you look terrible." Marcus let him in. He'd spent 3 days fighting the spiders, trying to maintain control. He was exhausted, broken. His apartment was full of webs that only he could see, spanning between dimensions. "It's Spider," Marcus said. He's not human, and he's infected me with something." Hayes sat down, his expression serious. "I know. I've been tracking him for longer than you think. This isn't my first encounter with things like him." "Things like him?" Hayes pulled out a badge, but not from Pine Ridge. It was from some organization Marcus didn't recognize, a symbol that looked like an eye surrounded by containment sigils. "I work for a group that deals with anomalous prisoners, the ones that can't be explained, can't be contained by normal means. Spider is one of many. We call them hosts, humans who've made pacts with entities from outside our reality. They're doorways for things that shouldn't exist." "Can you help me?" Hayes examined the mark on Marcus's neck. "Maybe, but it'll be dangerous. The process of removing the spiders might kill you, and even if it works, Spider will know. He'll retaliate. I don't care. I can't live like this." Hayes made some calls. Within hours, Marcus's apartment was full of people in hazmat suits, setting up equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. They drew symbols on the walls, laid out salt circles, and set up machines that hummed with strange frequencies. "We're going to try to extract them," Hayes explained. "But Spider will feel it happening. He'll send more." The procedure was agony. They used some kind of electromagnetic field combined with what Hayes called reality anchors to draw the spiders out. It felt like they were pulling out pieces of Marcus's soul. He could hear Spider's voice in his head, promising vengeance, promising that his family would suffer, showing him visions of his children covered in webs. Halfway through, the lights went out. The windows shattered. Thousands of spiders poured in from every opening. Not normal spiders. Things with too many eyes, legs like needles, bodies that seemed to phase in and out of reality. Hayes and his team fought them off with flamethrowers and some kind of sonic weapons that made reality itself scream. The battle lasted hours, or maybe minutes. Marcus couldn't tell through the pain. When it was over, Marcus was free. The spiders were gone, burned away by whatever process Hayes's people had used. But he was changed. He could still sense them, sense Spider, like a constant whisper at the edge of his consciousness. And sometimes, when he looked at shadows, he could see into that other dimension where the spiders truly lived. "It's done," Hayes said. "But you can never go back to Pine Ridge. Spider will kill you on sight now, and you'll always be sensitive to things like him. You'll see things others don't. Consider yourself recruited. What about my family? We'll relocate them. New identities, new city. It's the only way to keep them safe." "And Spider?" Hayes was quiet for a moment. "We're working on a solution. There's a facility in Alaska, built specifically for entities like him. Complete isolation, no human contact. We just need to find a way to transfer him without casualties." That was 6 months ago. Marcus and his family now live in a different state under different names. He works for Hayes's organization now, helping to identify and contain anomalous individuals. But every night, he dreams of spiders. And every morning, he checks his neck for bumps. Hayes keeps him updated. Spider is still at Pine Ridge. The death toll has risen to 23. They've tried to transfer him 3 times, but each attempt has resulted in casualties. The transport vehicles become infested, the guards become infected, and Spider remains. Last week, Marcus received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. It showed his new house taken from across the street. In the corner of the photo, barely visible, was a spider web. Written on the back in what looked like blood. The children remember their father's touch. "Distance means nothing to us. See you soon." Marcus has started seeing them again. The movements in his peripheral vision. The shapes in the shadows. His daughter Sarah mentioned that she's been having nightmares about spiders. His son James drew a picture at school of their family but gave everyone 8 legs. His wife found webs in the attic that weren't there before. Webs that seem to exist in more than 3 dimensions. Hayes says they're mobilizing a team, that they'll protect Marcus and his family. But Marcus knows the truth. You can't protect against something that exists partially outside our reality. You can't fight something that breeds in minds and souls. Spider had told him the truth that first day. Trouble tends to find others around him. And now, even hundreds of miles away, that trouble has found Marcus. Last night, Marcus's daughter came to his room at 3 a.m. Her eyes were gray, like spiders. "Daddy," she said in a voice that wasn't quite hers, "the Spider-Man says hello. He says we're going to be a family soon. All of us together, forever, in the web between worlds." Then she blinked, and her eyes were normal again. "Daddy, why am I out of bed?" Marcus hugged his daughter, feeling her small heart beating against his chest. But underneath her skin he could swear he felt something else moving. The infection hadn't been removed. It had just been dormant, waiting. And now it was spreading to his family, just as Spider had promised. Hayes called this morning. Spider escaped during another transfer attempt. 17 guards dead, 43 inmates missing. The prison is in lockdown, but it doesn't matter. Spider is free, and Marcus knows, with a certainty that chills him to his bones, that Spider is coming. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Because Spider told him once that he never forgets, never forgives, and Marcus had committed the ultimate sin. He'd rejected the gift, burned out the spiders, severed the connection, or so he'd thought. The truth is becoming clear now. The spiders were never really gone. They just went deeper, hid in places even Hayes' technology couldn't reach, and they've been growing, spreading, preparing. Marcus looks at his family at dinner, watches them eating, laughing, living their normal lives. But he sees the signs. The way his wife's shadow sometimes has too many arms. The way his son's eyes reflect light like an insect's. The way his daughter sometimes speaks in clicking sounds when she thinks no one is listening. They're all infected now, the whole family. And somewhere out there, Spider is coming to claim them. Marcus has one option left. Hayes gave him a device, a last resort. It would destroy everything within a mile radius, collapsing reality itself to seal any dimensional rifts. It would kill him, his family, everyone nearby. But it would stop Spider, stop the infection from spreading. The device sits in his desk drawer, looking like an innocent metal cylinder. Every night he holds it, wondering if tonight is the night he should use it. But then he looks at his children sleeping peacefully, his wife beside him, and he can't do it. Not yet. Maybe that's what Spider is counting on, the human weakness of love, of hope. Outside, in the darkness, something moves. Marcus goes to the window and sees him. Spider, standing across the street, smiling. But it's not just him. Behind him, Marcus can see the shadows of dozens of people. The missing inmates, the dead guards, all of them moving wrong, existing partially in another dimension. Spider raises his hand in a wave, and Marcus sees that his family is standing behind him. Not his actual family. They're still inside, asleep, but versions of them from another dimension, where the infection has completely taken over. They have too many limbs, too many eyes, bodies that shift and phase between realities. This is what's coming. This is what his family will become. Unless Marcus acts. He goes to his desk, takes out the device. His hands are steady now. He knows what he has to do. But as he's about to activate it, his daughter appears in the doorway. "Don't do it, Daddy," she says. But it's Spider's voice. "We're already inside. We've always been inside. Destroying this reality will just send us all to the other place, where we'll be together forever. There's no escape. There never was." Marcus looks at his daughter, at the device, at Spider still standing across the street, and he realizes the truth. The infection isn't something Spider does to people. People are the infection. Humanity itself is the doorway these entities have been trying to open, and Spider is just the key. The device slips from his fingers as the full horror of it washes over him. Every person Spider infects becomes another door, and when enough doors are open, his daughter smiles with too many teeth. "Now you understand, Daddy. Now you see. We're going to open all the doors. Every human, every mind, every soul. And when we're done, the two worlds will be one." Outside, Spider begins walking toward the house, his army of infected following. Marcus can hear his wife stirring in the bedroom, his son moving in his room. They're waking up, but are they still his family? Or are they something else now? Something wearing their faces. Something that was always waiting inside them, inside all of us, waiting for someone like Spider to come along and turn the key?